programs, and it's clear that many of you know them, their work, and their reputations. I'll just remind you that Anne Golden is the President and CEO of the Conference Board of Canada. Roger Martin is the Dean of the Rotman School and the head of the Martin Prosperity Institute. And the Tom Jenkins is the Executive Chairman and Chief Strategy Officer for OpenText Corporation. So let's begin. Each speaker will talk to us from the podium for 20 minutes, then we'll take a 10-minute break and return for a full hour of discussion amongst the panelists and Q&A with the audience. Let me now ask Anne Golden to come to the podium. Thank you. You go get me.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Bob. It's really great to be back at Couchiching, part of this terrific panel. We had a lot of fun at lunch. And to be part of such a distinguished gathering, both of the lineup of speakers and the participants. So I was invited to talk about how Canada can boost its productivity and innovation for long-term success. And I want to start with one very obvious point, namely that in a high-wage economy like Canada's, the only route to higher productivity and competitiveness in our global economy is innovation. And yet, while many agree on the general direction for reform, and there'll be quite a bit of agreement among us, there is no consensus on precisely what's to be done and who should do what. So my goal today is to give you my take on why we're not succeeding and what it will take to meet the challenge. Our poor productivity in Canada is not a recent problem. The growing gap in productivity between Canada and the U.S. has existed since the mid-'80s, despite the Canada-U.S. Free Trade Agreement and NAFTA, Tom might say because of it. We at the Conference Board have been beating the drum on that issue for about 15 years, and it is even more urgent today. At that time, Canada had fallen from 4th place in 1985, that's when we first noticed this, to 9th place in 1995 in income per capita among the 17 industrialized nations like our own. The latest OECD data, as of last week, now show us in 10th place, essentially where we were in the mid-90s. And the per capita income gap with the U.S. is now double what it was in real dollars in 1985. It's now about $7,000 per person versus $3,200. And over the past decade, our annual labor productivity growth averaged really a pitiful 1%. The U.S. rate was about 1.8%. And according to the Bank of Canada, Mark Carney last February, if this pattern continues, Canada will lose about $1 trillion over the next decade. And that will translate into about $30,000 in income for every Canadian. So the question is, can Canada close the productivity gap with the U.S.? And the answer is, it won't be easy. Just the sheer numbers will tell you that. And countries with lower levels of productivity not only have to grow faster to catch up, but they have to maintain that faster growth over a longer period of time. It's really tough when you fall behind. So, if the U.S. productivity were to grow by the same rate that I mentioned, 1.8%, that was the average over the past decade, for the next 15 years, our productivity growth rate would have to be 3.4% to catch up, which is more than 3 times our actual productivity growth rate this decade. Closing this gap, and this is a whole other speech, but ties in a bit to what Margaret talked about last night. Why do we care about this? It's essential to our own standard of living and to our capacity to provide services and programs we all want for a better society. We're not only moving too slowly, we're moving in the wrong direction. Now, to answer the question posed for this afternoon, can we change this direction? We actually need to appreciate what's involved. And so I'm going to ask you, if all of you would, to mentally picture a triangle. This is our framework for productivity, and it will take 1 minute, but I'm going to ask you to picture this triangle, because if you don't understand the complexity, we won't be able to have as good a discussion. At the bottom of this triangle are all the global factors that affect productivity, over which we as Canadians have very little control. So world commodity prices, catastrophic events like 9/11, pandemics, remember SARS, the economic implosion in Greece and Europe's reaction to it. These are all huge factors that affect us, but we don't really have control. So now move up the triangle and you're in the middle segment. Now here, governments have control. These are the various aspects that affect our business and policy environment. So you've got the tax regime, regulatory regimes, the industrial structure of the country. How much of us is small business versus big or medium? Foreign ownership and the degree of competition that we want or allow. Our openness to trade and investment. Urbanization and the type and quality of infrastructure. These are generally determined by our governments. Now we're at the peak of the triangle. And here, really, there's just three divisions. These are the factors specific to firms or companies, and here we as individuals have control. The quality of the workforce, education and skills, the amount and quality of the firm's physical capital, machinery and equipment, and the firm's culture around innovation. And this is going to be a main theme for me. Other organizations have different productivity frameworks to ours. Rogers has a different one, but yet we all arrive at the same conclusion. Canada's productivity gap is rooted mainly in a failure to innovate, and very specifically, if you think of innovation as creating, sharing, and transforming, and then commercializing or marketing new products and services, where we fall down is our failure to commercialize our research, our development, our inventions, and as Bob mentioned, our intentions. So if we have consensus, why can't we just solve this problem? Why haven't we been able to make headway? So let me suggest there's 4 reasons that are blocking us. First, if I can borrow the title of a 2-star movie, we have a failure to launch. In our decade-long work on innovation, we determined that when it comes to creating knowledge and sharing it, Canada actually does pretty well. Where we fall down is we don't cash in on our creativity. Last year we did this major benchmarking report. We used outcome indicators, not how much we spend and how much input, but actually we looked at things like patents or the proportion of our knowledge-intensive industries as a share of our domestic economy or as a share of our exports, and we had about 14 of these indicators. And what did we find? We find that we ranked 14 out of 17 developed countries. In fact, Canada got a D. We then took the same criteria and we went back and looked at the same things going back the last 3 decades, so for 40 years. Are you surprised to learn that we have been a consistent D performer? I don't think so. Let me give you one example that I think will resonate. I thought of this example because here we are in this beautiful bucolic setting, Geneva Park. Crocs shoes. How many of you in this room knew that Canadians invented Crocs? Truthfully, how many of you knew? 10 of us. The plastic clog design was developed as a spa shoe by a Quebec company. It was called Foam Creations. It was acquired by an American entrepreneur who happened to be working in Quebec at the time, and he commercialized them into fashion shoes. Once deemed the fastest growing footwear company on the planet, Crocs had the largest IPO in the history of the shoe industry. And in 2008, its revenue was over $720 million, lost opportunity for us. But then you're probably thinking, what about the BlackBerry? Bob was thinking about the BlackBerry. Agreed. It's exactly what we need. Much needed high-tech global product that's created billions of dollars in new revenues and thousands of above-the-neck jobs. So why is Canada not commercializing what it does create? Various think tanks, institutes and forums, including ours and Rogers, the expert panel on business innovation, the National Innovation Roundtable, have all delineated and stated what needs to be done. Nor have they been shy with advice. We have consistently at the Conference Board called for about 6 measures. And I'm going to be brief here because I want to get on to, this is sort of the basics. First of all, they include opening Canadian industries to competitive pressures. And that means reducing barriers to foreign investment. This is a sensitive issue for Canadians. And the Red Wilson panel, I think, is moving us forward, and Tom was on that panel. Second, improving the level and quality of what they call capital intensity, but what is really machinery and equipment, the expansion of plants, and a lot of that is ICT. Thirdly, investing more in people, human capital. Post-grad education, in particular, is where Canada doesn't look so great. We do pretty well up until the end of high school. And lifelong learning, where we do very poorly. Fourth, focusing our infrastructure investments strategically in our major cities, where most innovation occurs. We tend to, and even during the stimulus we did, spread our infrastructure investments like peanut butter across the land. 5, unleashing organizational and managerial innovation. If you go, by the way, onto the chapters, you'll see they have 4,000 current listings on this topic, but where Tom can likely provide some concrete advice from his personal experience. 2 more, removing barriers to trade within Canada by aligning our regulatory standards and processes among all levels of government, and harmonizing Canada's regs with the US and appropriate international standards. I think few innovation advocates would disagree with this package of reforms. But when it comes to translating these broad strategies into specific policies and actions, there is no agreement. I was telling Roger at lunch that I was part of a panel, actually Jim Milway was there. We had this national roundtable on innovation comprising top academic and business leaders who are really, I would say, preoccupied with innovation. We met this past spring. It was a great day. And we spent most of our time analyzing past reports. We were going to solve the innovation conundrum. And at the end of the day, John Manley and Paul Lucas were chairing it, and they said, okay, we've just looked at all these reports, we did a lot of pre-work. What are the 3 things, there were 30 of us in the room, what are the 3 things that we have to do to solve the innovation conundrum? 30 of us picked 31 different sets of priorities. Failure to launch is a big issue. I put it first on my list. It's very hard with such divergent advice for governments to pick exactly what should be done. The second reason why we're not making progress, this is a little bit provocative maybe, governments have shied away from choosing niches, at least to choosing them and letting us know what these niches are. It's not that they don't subsidize and make decisions about what sectors to give support to, but they have shied away from choosing strategic niches where we can build globally competitive businesses. We have focused on supporting public R&D, much less on turning the fruits of that research into new and significantly improved products and services. So we focus on the lab and not the market. We've been doing research on this. Just suffice it to say, for about 4 or 5 years, we had 2 panels. The first one had 48 of Canada's top academic, business, and government leaders in the room saying, what is the most important thing we can do to kickstart the innovation economy? And they said, pick national priority areas where we have critical mass, where we have leaders who want to be global leaders, where we have the science and technology capability behind us, and we actually have the capacity to compete. And then, 3 years later, they did something very brave. This leaders panel picked the 3 areas where we should be running the race. And what were they? Clean energy, water management technologies, and regenerative medicine. Now, I have to say that recently Ontario has invested in the first 2, but again, at the research end of the spectrum. Now, I have to also say the idea of government choosing priority areas has always been contentious, and I have my own doubts myself because of how I have seen things play out in my life. Some believe that this kind of government intervention unlevels the playing field. Others believe that by the time government chooses the priorities, by definition they're passé and the opportunity has passed. So many believe that the government's role is only to create the conditions in which firms can operate, as I would say the current federal and provincial governments are really trying to do with policies on foreign direct investment, in particular with tax regimes and regulatory regimes. The question is that enough? I don't think so. We don't think so. The third reason why we're not making progress, and this is a huge issue, business leaders haven't stepped up to the plate. So again, think of my triangle, which is in your heads, that top triangle. That's where business leaders have control, but they have not exercised the leadership that they could or should. Our businesses do not invest in R&D and in modernizing their machinery and their equipment writ large. As Kevin Lynch noted in his article about a week ago in the Globe and Mail, the public sector is in fact doing its part. In fact, in Canada, our public sector investment in research as a proportion of the economy is now higher than it is in either the US or indeed in most OECD countries. R&D, of course, is the pivotal driver for the development of new technologies, products, and services. Yet we rank 12th out of the 17 peer countries, about half the amount that is spent in little countries like Sweden and Finland. And yet we know that countries with higher machinery and equipment investments, and in particular ICT technology, generally have higher productivity growth. In fact, though, our investment in machinery and equipment as a percent of GDP is among the lowest of its peer countries. So why aren't business leaders doing what they could and should? Is it because they're being held back by the general operating conditions like provincial trade barriers or overlong approval processes for new products and projects? Is it because that they lack the leadership and management training? Is it because short-term business pressures trump long-term strategies? I don't think we really know. This particular aspect hasn't been researched exhaustively. And I would say that I approach this question with humility. My father was an entrepreneur, and I understand that balancing risk management and aggressive growth strategy is not easy, so I don't want to sound glib. But there's no doubt that our business leaders can be more creative and effective when it comes to innovation, and I will return to this theme in a few minutes. But now on to problem number 4. And this links to Margaret's concern last night on whether we'll absorb the lessons from the recent global fiscal crisis. And that is, the platform is not viewed as burning. Our view, as the conference board, is that the Canadian business leaders have not really had to innovate on a major scale. Perhaps now, the high dollar and the aging workforce will fan the flames, and we'll see that the platform is burning, maybe. But in the 90s, they could rely on the depreciating dollar to compete. Some have called this the lazy exporter thesis. And in this decade, business growth and profitability have depended on booming global commodity markets and the now expired North American consumer binge. We all need to internalize the reality that Canada is becoming less competitive in our global economy. I always use the metaphor of the school kid, with really brilliant school kid in the class and the gifted child, but every year he's moving further and further to the back of the class. We must realize that the platform is burning. Entrepreneurs must understand that their company's competitiveness depends on their capacity to innovate and to think globally. And we need to understand that if we don't, our future prosperity is at risk. Well, having tried to explain now what's holding us back, what were my 3 priorities when I was in that room? What do I think we should really be doing among the many things that have been suggested? So this is a little bit risky, but I will give you my 3. First, priority 1, Canada's governments working with industry should support a small number of targeted niche areas where we can grow globally competitive high-tech industries. As I mentioned, we've named 3: clean energy technologies, regenerative medicine, and water management technologies. You may be thinking of others. The broad challenge in each case is to move from success in the lab to success in the market. On clean energy, what does that mean? It means we need to put a price on carbon, and we need to align our support for new technology with federal and provincial regulation. On regenerative medicine, what does it mean? We need to strengthen the links between the discoveries and the clinical trials and the centers of excellence that improve practitioner knowledge and the use of the new technologies. Shorter regulatory reviews and better export support from our overseas commercial officers would also help. On water management technologies, we need to use pricing and regulation to bring innovative technologies to market. Just let me give a tiny example. There's a handful of Canadian companies that are world leaders in technologies that convert tidal motion or wave motion into electrical power. And they do get strong support from government programs, government test sites, and government-funded academic research. But their challenge is they can't convince the planning departments of provincially owned utilities that their technology will work. So to overcome this resistance and to move the technology from lab to market, we need policy and regulatory changes that encourage, that incent, or possibly even require innovative technologies in the generation mix. That's the first priority. The second priority, governments should invest strategically in the infrastructure of Canada's major cities where most innovation occurs. And they also need to invest in relieving our cross-border bottlenecks. This is fundamental to creating a productivity and innovation framework integral to Canada's long-term sustainable prosperity. It is true that in our digital economy, innovation relies on data as its core infrastructure. But it also relies on physical connectivity, and the lack of basic infrastructure of our roads and transit hobbles our economic activity, undermines our productivity, and smothers innovation. If infrastructure is indeed destiny, and in Canada's case that would seem to be true, we need to act. So imagine the boon to productivity if we had high-speed rail connecting Toronto, Montreal, and Ottawa on the east, or Calgary and Edmonton in the west. We've talked about it. You know, President Obama just invested $8 billion in a number of regions in the States. And there's even talk of building a high-speed rail between New York and Montreal. But it would be great if we had one in our own country connecting our cities. Imagine if we could end the transportation gridlock in our city regions. In the GTA alone, we lose $3 billion every year due to lost productivity. Metrolinx has produced a good plan, but funds are not available to make it real. Many options have been discussed: road tolls, regional gas or sales tax, levy on commercial parking spaces, congestion charges. Not all are suitable. Not all of these are suitable. But we need an informed discussion on how to fund the infrastructure and ongoing operations. And imagine the benefits if we unblock the traffic bottleneck on the bridge between Windsor and Detroit. I know the second bridge is in the offing, but I have been hearing that for a long, long time. That's where more than $100 billion of trade flows per year. And third, and this is not least, this is maybe first, we need to boost business investment in R&D and state-of-the-art equipment. We've already improved the macroeconomic environment, notably through tax reform. We have the SHRED credits, but we need to look beyond those SHRED credits, which focus on the research end. Strategies like tax credits and flow-through shares have worked in the past, and they're being looked at again. But we need to incent and encourage business to step up to the plate. There's more to be done. Lots has been written about the need for a more robust venture capital market. For sure, it would make a big difference. How to do that is the rub, I should say. Canadian venture capitalists invest about 2/3 less each year than their U.S. counterparts, and mostly we invest in early stage development. We're very Canadian about that. We like to invest in the startups. But once they're sort of making it, then we say, okay, you're on your own. Governments can reduce the time and business costs to get regulatory approvals for new technologies and products without undermining intended safeguards. We wait too long for new drugs, healthier food products, and safer technologies compared to both Americans and Europeans. We have a cumbersome regulatory process, and the truth is we don't have enough people to actually do the job. That's one big reason for the backlog. So if you compare, it takes 30 months to get patents for biopharmaceutical products that are approved in Canada compared to what is the 10-month average for other industrialized countries. And what's more, I've mentioned this already, the intra-provincial regulatory barriers to labor mobility, trade and investment need to be eased. Yes, we have TILMA between BC and Alberta. Yes, Ontario and Quebec are doing more together. That's good. Lots more to be done. So, to sum up, we need to target niche areas for growth, invest in city-region infrastructure, and boost business investment in R&D and state-of-the-art equipment. Those would be my 3 top priorities.
And 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. Okay. But at the core of all this comes the question of how do we change the mindset? Because if you look at the individual decisions that are made, it's really, I think, goes to a question of culture and mindset. I wanted to ask, are we the image captured in that old joke, why do Canadians cross the road? The answer, to get to the middle. I don't know if any of you have read the book Startup Nation, the story of Israel's economic miracle, but it offers startling comparisons to our own situation. No time to go into that now, but what makes Israel so innovative and entrepreneurial? Lots of good reasons. That are 8 sets of reasons are listed by the authors. But the one they come down to, beyond all the obvious reasons, venture capital systems, support systems, proximity, a lot of the stuff that goes along with Porter's thesis, is that Israel has a cultural core built on a rich stew of aggressiveness and team orientation, on isolation and connectedness, on being small and aiming big. Can Canada acquire this kind of entrepreneurial spirit? I am hoping so. I'm hoping that we can develop more of our own rich stew, a cultural brew that breeds innovation. Like our keynote speaker last night, I too, as an historian, have always been interested in what causes change. Change occurs when the climate of opinion changes. As a country, we only addressed our fiscal deficits and public debt challenges when we internalized the realization that we faced a crisis. So will this be a watershed moment for Canada? Improving our productivity, I would suggest, is not a want to do, it is an imperative. Ideally, our rich stew would combine our traditional sense of caution, which has served us on occasion very well and is now being praised as prudence, with a stronger dash of entrepreneurialism and chutzpah. Closing paragraph, Bob. Canadians have what it takes to succeed. We are richly endowed with resources and with people. Our fiscal management has won us international respect. We are open to newcomers, and we are attracting terrific talent from abroad, which can only beef up our ambition DNA. Our success in the Winter Olympics, through Own the Podium, suggests that we are now inclined to go for the gold. We are the country that invented both the zipper and the BlackBerry. We can do this.
Let me now ask Roger Martin to come to the podium, and yes, it is 20 minutes each.
Well, I would love to get some help from this audience, because I think this audience has got all sorts of incredible public policy experience, and the help I need is that on the innovation front, the usual is not happening. So for me, at least in the sort of the public policy influence approach or strategy that I've taken, I've had to learn this, is that you have to do a whole bunch of research, get the right answer, then talk about it incessantly for 5 years until you're tired of hearing yourself talk about it, absolutely disgusted when you hear yourself mouth the words again, and then change starts to happen. And the reason is not because people are silly or the like. It's just that it takes a long time for these things to sort of filter through and get to the places they need, get people comfortable with the ideas. And it took 5 years for post-secondary education or graduate education in Ontario. It took 5 years for harmonization. So I have the 5-year rule. You got to do all the hard work and then talk, and then it happens. And I'm at 9 on innovation, and I've been working on this issue for 9 years, and I think we have good answers. We've done lots of work, and nothing, not a single thing has happened. Nothing, absolutely nothing. So, and you might say it's because they're bad ideas. You've got, the wrong answer. But everywhere other than Canada, they're having quite substantial impact. So either myself personally or the school and the work we're doing are helping Procter & Gamble, Steelcase, AstraZeneca, Nestle, Medtronic, SAP, Pfizer, the government of Singapore teach its medium-sized businesses about innovation. I just got word from an acquaintance, not somebody I even know very well, who's in Korea. This was last week, and they said, Roger, you'd be happy to know the senior people at Samsung were saying the model that you and Claudia Kochka used to change innovation at Procter & Gamble is the model that's seen in Korea as the model for changing innovation in a big company. And I'm saying, oh, that's good. So it's not as though this doesn't have any resonance. So I'm in the Q&A. Help. I have no real idea what to do because I've been 9 years and counting. There are days now where I sort of dream of being the W. Edwards Deming of innovation. So this would be fun, right? Which is that, although not as much fun, right? So Deming was the guy who said, no, the way he's American, thinking about quality is just kind of not the most useful, intelligent way to think about quality. Had a very different view. He said, the American view of quality there was you have a whole bunch of inspectors at the end of the assembly line and you inspect things really carefully and you fix them if they're not high quality. And he said, no, I think quality is a system. And you've got to kind of create quality in the entire system and watch it along the way. And the Japanese all said, that looks good. The Korean said, that looks good, and basically stomped all over a bunch of American industries. But it was, and there's Deming Awards, and he's a heroic figure there. And very late in his life, somebody phoned him up in America and said, "You have some ideas." So, but anyway, I digress, as I often do. So what is the problem? Is not that we have a bad innovation policy. We don't have one, and we never have had one. We have no innovation policy, and that's a problem. If you want to have more innovation and spur innovation, and maybe you should have a policy. We have an invention policy. An invention and innovation are different. And until we understand the difference, I think we will have no innovation policy. We have an invention policy, and it's a pretty good invention policy. I don't think it's actually anything innovative, but it's good. What's invention? Invention is a new-to-the-world discovery or creation that's driven primarily by an inventor who's curious about something. The merit of invention is defined by how unique it is, and it's based primarily on scientific skills. Innovation is a product or a service or a process that creates new value for customers. It's defined primarily by the desire to add customer value. Its merit is defined by profitable deployment, and it takes a broad range of strategic, marketing, operational, and technical and scientific skills. We have no policy for the latter at all. Unless, of course, you think benign neglect is a policy, and that has been a policy in certain fields. And I would illustrate it by the stimulus budget we've just had. And by the way, Ann and I agree on almost everything. I agree with Ann that the government, this government, the federal government, the Ontario government have done many, many good things to get the economic fundamentals right. So I give them great credit for that. Though again, not much that you can point to on any of those fronts that's actually innovative, unless you consider having a fantastic GST and tearing it down. But I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that before. But in this stimulus budget, right, we put $613 million new dollars to work on creating economic growth and jobs through innovation. Of that $613 million, if I went through and categorized it, 40%, $249 million was for invention, so we put more money behind our invention policy, and our invention policy is the bog standard one: fund scientific, research, and that's good. You got to have invention, and so it's just put another $249 million for that. We put $349 million, 57%, into things that have absolutely no utility for innovation, none. And we put 3%, or $15 million, into stuff that could potentially be useful for innovation. So we had $613 million to spend on an innovation policy, and $15 million of that has a shot of being useful, in innovation. That unfortunately is our innovation policy. Now, the problem with the narrowly defined invention-driven job growth is it just isn't very big. So people sort of think that that the high-tech industries, so if you take all of computer hardware and software together, telecommunications hardware and software, aerospace, medical devices, pharma and biotech, you add all of those together and ask what percentage of the jobs in America are in those 5 sectors now. 1.76 is the answer. 1.76% of the jobs in the economy. So if you have a policy that spurs invention in those areas, it's good. You create companies. That's helpful. I'm not saying don't do it. But if you somehow expect that to produce great gobs of jobs across the economy, no. And yet, and everybody does complain about Canada. We're way behind in those industries. We are behind the United States in those industries. We have 1.64% of our jobs in those industries. And actually, if we caught up with the United States across this great land of ours, we'd have 35,000 more jobs in high technology as a percentage, the same percentage, 35,000 jobs across Canada. This is not the problem. I promise you, it is not the problem. The problem is across the other 98% of the economy, we're not innovative. And we're doing nothing, absolutely nothing, to make us more innovative. Innovation in the rest of the economy matters a whole lot and creates gigantic companies. FedEx, Walmart, Dell, Barnes & Noble, companies like that innovate are creating monstrous numbers of jobs, but wouldn't be considered innovative companies in Canada in our innovation policy. Why? Because their innovations are not based directly on scientific research. So innovation policy is not about scientific research. We do need to have scientific research, and scientific research will end up in some innovation. There is no question. So I am not at all against that. The trouble is that scientific research, by and large, is looking for new-to-the-world creations that are curiosity-based. And the notion that somehow that curiosity will connect with customer needs is small. I'm afraid it's small. Now, I would argue in the medical sciences it's highest, right? Because consumer needs are really easiest to identify there. They're very, very clear. We have a horrible disease. We want to cure that. And so that's why I think there's the closest connection there. Another thing, and you'll have to excuse some of my bugaboos, I'll try not to have too many of them, is an innovation strategy is not about funding more venture capital. We have to think about venture capital with more clear eyes. And I will bore you with some statistics about venture capital. There's a company called Cambridge Associates that is the definitive collector of venture capital statistics in the United States. It doesn't sample venture capitalists to figure out something. It actually tracks all venture capital companies in America and has the database on the 1,294 venture capital funds that have started between 2001 and 2010 and has their returns and publishes them. When we fell in love with venture capital, we fell in love with it in a certain period. And why did we fall in love with it? Because of these statistics. If you were one of the 15 funds that started in 1990, you made 35% compound annual return on your money during the life of that fund. In 1991, you made 29% compound annual return. 92, you made 35%. 93, you made 47%. 94, you made 56%. 95, you made 88%. And this is all after all fees deducted. 96, you made 99% compound annual return during the life of your fund. 97, you made 85%. The real disastrously bad year was 1998, where you made a mere 12% on your money. That's when we fell in love with this thing called venture capital, and we thought it worked and it was an unstoppable model. 1999, funds that started in 1999 didn't do so hot. Minus 2% compound annual over their lifetime. But we were up to 114 funds by that time, started in that year. 2000, minus 1%, 161 funds. 2001, 0.6%, we got into the black. 0.6, not 6, 0.6. 2002, minus 0.2. 2003, 3.9, almost T-bill rates. 2004, 2.3%. 2005, 0.1%. 2006, negative 1.9%. 2007, negative 3.9%. And then 2008, 0.6. 2009, negative 2.0, but they're so new that they may yet make lots of money. 11 years of sub-T-bill rates. 11 years of zero, actually. 0.3. That's zero, close enough? Close enough. So right now, as we're saying, we have to get more money into venture capital, and that's what's going to do it, is saying we're going to put more money into something that is busted in the home of venture capital. It is broken. It's absolutely broken. And interesting enough, in 2009, even though these numbers are not as good, because angel investing is not as well documented, but there's a belief that in the fourth quarter of 2009, angel investment was higher for the first time than venture capital. So let's not bet our innovation strategy on pumping something more into an industry that I think is going under a transformation that's a result of it not working for more than a decade. Venture capital has been a profoundly bad investment for 11 years. Profoundly bad investment, and shows no signs of coming back. Now, one of the things that we tend to do on this is blame it on business, right? And say blame it on business leaders, and I agree. I think why aren't we innovative? It's because for so very, very many years this economy worked on the basis of waiting and checking and seeing what's done elsewhere, and then doing it in Canada behind a huge tariff wall. Surprise, surprise. That's what this economy learned to do, and learned to do over a long, long period of time. And on one hand, I'd say it's perfectly fair to say the government has done its part, right? The government's done its part. It's fixed the macroeconomic structure. It's done its part. It's business leaders' fault. And if they'd only be innovative, everything would be fine. Yeah, I guess, sure. If that's kind of what you want to do, you want to say as a government, it would be hard to figure out a way to get you to be more innovative, so we'll blame you for it and you be innovative. How about that? I mean, I guess I would think that if you want to have an innovation policy, you might want to say, why don't we try something innovative? And on that front, I guess my fundamental question is, why is it that we think that you can train all sorts of other things that are useful for the economy, like we train all of these sort of medical scientists, and we train these engineers and lawyers and doctors and stuff. And in the modern economy, it's becoming absolutely crystal clear that innovation is critical. Right? Absolutely crystal clear that innovation is critical as borders between countries drop, as competition gets more fierce, you have to innovate more quickly. And we haven't said, shouldn't we think about training it up? Training people on this thing. If we don't do enough of it, must be because we're not so good at it. Why don't we train them up? And this is why I've been running this empirical study for the last 5 years. That's what we've been doing. We've been training up people on innovation. You can train them. You can train them to understand more deeply user needs. You can teach them how to visualize, prototype, and build activity systems that produce advantage. It's absolutely doable. I promise you, it's trainable. And so that's all I would say. We can solve the innovation problem. We can actually train people how to innovate. That would be my recommendation. Thank you.
And now let me invite Tom to talk about how he would create great gobs of jobs. Okay.
Well, I'm sort of that Monty Python movie, and now for something completely different. Because I'm not a policy person, not a researcher. I'm, maybe the best way to think of it, I'm your witness from outside of Canada, let's say. Because I'm Canadian, but I've spent most of my life, my adult life, outside of my own country. I've always lived here, but everything I've done has been for global markets and not for Canadian markets. In fact, most of my career, I've ignored Canada because Canada represents 2.5% of the world GDP. So as a business person, you're taught in business, go where the biggest part of the market is. And for many, many years, of course, that's been America. But of course, that's also changing. It is sort of instructive, though, from a micro point of view. My company, OpenText, is $1 billion multinational, and yet most of you in the audience wouldn't know it, and that's because we don't really have anything to do with Canada, you know? And so, therefore, there might be something to that we don't necessarily pay attention to the Canadian market. And I would abstract that a little bit more, RIM being accepted. I'm also a Waterloo tech guy. And most of the Waterloo folks also ignore Canada. They're Canadians, they're passionate Canadians, but when it comes to business and they're designing a product, they're thinking about outside of Canada. Because if we tried to build our customer base in Canada, we'd be creamed by the Americans or the Chinese or the Indians, et cetera, because they're building for much bigger marketplaces. So that's sort of maybe a suggestion of maybe the culture or the way we approach things, maybe it needs to be a little bit different. Now, by the way, I only have one sheet of paper, so I'm more interested in the discussion. But I will touch on a few things that I've learned in my journey. About 3 years ago, I was asked to sort of get back involved in my own country by both the federal and provincial governments and sit on some panels. Anne referred to one, Roger referred to another. And these were panels, one set up by the federal government to review. It has the sort of august name of the Competition Policy Review Panel. That was quite a mouthful to say, but we reported 2 years ago, and it's referred to today as sort of the Red Wilson report. And we went through and looked at Canada's position. And, you know, again and again, one of the reasons why, again, just as an observer, I'm not speaking for the panel or the report, we're an incredibly rich country, asset rich. We were born with just some huge, huge advantages. And so therefore, we may not be as compelled as other nation states, whether it's Israel or China or India, et cetera, to be as, you know, pushy or competitive, you know, the so-called nice Canadian. Let me tell you this, to be productive, I don't wake up in the morning thinking about being more productive. I'm forced to think that way. I'm forced to think that way because the other company that I'm competing with in the world is thinking that way. And if I don't keep up to them, my company will go out of business. So we have to understand as Canadians that productivity and innovation, it's hard and it's brutal and it's ruthless. You know, we as Canadians, we know this on a hockey rink. We know that the toughest, the fastest, the most gifted, we know that. We understand competition in hockey rinks. What we need to understand is that globally, outside of our borders, and we have many, many protections, and I would take issue with some of our previous speakers that on a macro level, we haven't quite dealt with all of these policy things that have to happen for us to be truly an innovative country. And the reason why is we have created a lot of protected sectors. When we speak about the productivity gap with the Americans or indeed many of the other OECD countries, you know, it's not a level playing field. The reality is that there are no less than 6 sectors within our economy and big chunks of our economy that are in fact protected. And that means that, you know, I don't want to name the names, but, you know, a certain corporation can't come into Canada to force the corporations that are already here. Now, we chose to do that because that's what makes us Canadian. But when we speak about productivity, we should be a little bit more clear about what we mean by this. So I'll give you an example. I was quite struck by all these productivity numbers that literally was a graph that just was falling like a rock in our productivity against the Americans. And I knew in my own personal experience, we were just as competitive, just as productive as our competitors in America. In fact, for a Canadian company to sell in New York, you could argue we'd have to be better. And sure enough, during the panel, we asked StatsCan to subset all the different sectors of the Canadian economy. And sure enough, the ones that had no protections were just as productive, just as competitive as anywhere else in the world. And our business leaders are just as smart, if not smarter, than any others in the world. It's just that they're playing to the rules of the game that we as Canadians have set up for them. And maybe the discussion we should have is, what is that costing us in productivity? And maybe we as Canadians should decide, do we want these sectors protected or not? Because a lot of these protections is what makes us Canadian. So we have to be careful in this discussion to not just focus on raw productivity numbers and then forget about what makes us Canadian. Because some of those very protections lead to that lower productivity. I was in the OECD, and they had looked at the world, and they, of course, were looking at the macro issues of communism, socialism, capitalism, etc. And they came with 3 truths that I always took away. That productivity comes from innovation, and innovation comes from competitive intensity. And that is true across every market they studied. And we should always remember that if we want to benchmark ourselves on productivity, then hence innovation, then we better go to the competitiveness thing and look at that and, have that discussion. But we can't have it both ways. We can't have it both ways. We can't, on the one hand, say, okay, we're going to rig the game for Canada this way, and then compare ourselves to everyone else that's really playing a different game. So that's a challenge for us, and that might reduce Roger's torture when it comes to policy discussions. I think the other thing that's worthwhile to talk about, say on the innovation and invention issue, it is a real issue for us. Because we have something that a lot of us call the Valley of Death, where many Canadian corporations get to 40 or 50 million, and the OECD stats show this straight line comparison of our generation of companies until it hits 40 to 50 million, and then we just drop like a rock. There is a huge gap, and whether it's venture capital or other forms of finance or intellectual property protection or all the various things that go into commercializing, we as a country better solve that. Because if we don't solve that, that feeder system of the next rim is not there. So that's a real challenge that hopefully people can pay attention to. And then the last thing I'll speak to on productivity, at the heart of productivity, 2/3 of the productivity gap that has occurred between Canadian companies and other companies in Canada, or in America, and the world at large, really comes down to computers, our use of computers. And I brought along and put at the back, because that's what my company does. We do productivity software. And I brought a book, and it's at the back. And that book talks about 63 companies all throughout the world that used computer technology to be more innovative. Just as Roger said, we're missing the point about computers and information technology and what have you. It's really about what it does to the rest of our economy. It's not making these computer companies. It's actually what those computer companies then allow our resource companies, our telecommunication companies, our media companies can do. And that's a huge point, and one that I'm very concerned about, because as I travel the world, we're in danger of missing some of this because of that lack of competitive intensity. And for those of you that study economics and what have you, we all remark on the fact that China and the Asian basin is coming back. And the key word is coming back, because the reality is that only 300 years ago, they were 60% of the world GDP, but they missed the Industrial Revolution. The great danger for us is missing the information revolution. And you can all say, well, we've got BlackBerries and we've got the internet and what have you. But for those of you that haven't traveled to Tokyo, you will very quickly understand that we are not grasping the information revolution. Just go on a subway in Tokyo and watch and compare that to anywhere in Canada. So it's a real challenge for us. So with that, I look forward to questions, and that's it for me.